Hello, my name is Gary Blatto-Vallee, and this is my presentation for my final paper for CEP 533. And my topic is factors that relate to improved outcomes in mathematics for deaf and hard of hearing students. The word improved, I don't want you to feel that we're talking about an intervention happening and then scores that were previously poor become better. It just means, what I mean by this is that these are deaf students who show better math outcomes, and see the factors of how that relates to that. The purpose, to examine factors in students' background and identify which of those factors correlate with higher math outcomes for deaf and hard of hearing students. Background, why mathematics, why deaf? Why deafness? Why deaf and hard of hearing students? You'll notice I capitalized the word deaf because for me it's a cultural identity. So in keeping with that, deaf people are a cultural group, so I use the word deaf capitalized in all my slides. So deaf and hard of hearing students, children lag behind their hearing peers by about 3 years. This has been noted in America for quite a few years, and then also internationally, Japan, Norway, I think Japan, Finland, and England also. Kreitzer, in 2009, the second bullet point here, found that deaf and hard of hearing children were behind their hearing peers before even getting to school. And this gets at language exposure and language in the home, and the fact that 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So envision yourself as a parent, you don't know anything about deafness, you have a child, your child's deaf, and now your world is rocked, and then your child now is going to have a diminished access to language in their home environment. But there are steps that can be taken, there are interventions that can be used, there are early detection. There's many steps that can be to mitigate that reality and to diminish or have those effects disappear, actually, with targeted and purposeful exposure to language for your deaf child. Anyways, the areas that Karen found, or Kreitzer found, were the skip counting, number comparisons, being able to write 2- and 3-digit numbers, and then addition, subtraction, facts. And these are ages between 4 and 6. Now, some researchers more recently, especially language specialists and language development, are looking at those environments of deaf children when they're born to a hearing family. If they aren't given sign language exposure, they aren't given access to a visible language because they can't hear the language being spoken, and what they can hear is fuzzy, so not getting good input. They need a visually accessible language, American Sign Language, given to them. And if that's not there, if for whatever reason the parents don't do that, or they're advised not to do that, which does happen, you're looking at a language deprivation situation where what should be naturally occurring in language development, now these children have serious delays in their language development due to this environment. Now, as far as deafness in mathematics goes, being deaf doesn't mean you can't do math. What it means is, actually means in random analysis, and deafness, or the severity of deafness, had little or no explanation for the variance in math ability. Now, intervention does work. Nunes and Moreno, again, they were looking at some of the informal math skills and knowledge that kids bring to school with them, and looked at deaf children and see where they were lacking and didn't have those skills that we expect them to have at kindergarten or first grade, and then designed an intervention to actually address those specific things. And children made significant gains. They were able to close the gap, at least for a time being. Where I work, typical class, we had entering freshman class. Now these are students who are getting associate's degrees. Where I work, we have baccalaureate degrees also, but my college, we are a technical school, so we primarily give out associate's degrees at the AOS, AAS, and AS levels. Our AS degree students are students that are wanting to get a bachelor's degree and they're going to transfer over to other colleges. Your AAS is possible. AOS are designed to be terminal degrees and for students who are going right to work after college. Anyways, the typical entering class, 79% of them entered, those freshmen, deaf college freshmen, scoring below the 50th percentile on the ACT mathematics subtest. And then 32% of that class actually scored at or below chance. So now, my study, what I'm proposing anyways, secondary data analysis, and I have two recent studies that have attempted a similar thing with different data sets. The first one we're going to talk about is Marshark, Shaver, Nagel, and Newman, 2015. They took the NLTS2 database and nationally they follow students for several years and administer measures. So there are 500 deaf and hard of hearing students identified in the sample of over 11,000 students. In this data set, Marshark and company accessed the Woodcock-Johnson 3 measures, academic achievement tests. They were administered, and they found that across all subject areas, deaf and hard of hearing students who attended public schools, like normal schools, outperformed deaf and hard of hearing students who went to schools for the deaf. They call them special schools. The study did. The normal was a public school or a school for the deaf. And they also said that having better speech ability was correlated with higher academic scores. The problem I see, the correlations are correct, but it implies that either the environment or the students are gaining more in public schools. And that's a complicated history only because since the ADA passed, deaf students, well, their families have been migrating them over to mainstream situations because they have the ability to have choice now, which is wonderful. And because some states you have to send your kid to a school for the deaf, they have one in the whole state. So if you can keep your child at home and send them to a local school system with an interpreter and the support services, I understand. I'll begrudge any parent that choice. But the result is that the schools for the deaf are getting smaller, and many of them have closed. Some are turning to specialize in multiple disabilities. And so what you're left with are students who are in the school for the deaf who couldn't, for whatever reason, academic, socially, or maybe have other disabilities, like I mentioned, are in the school for the deaf, where the students who are in the public schools are a different kind of student now. So to look at those and compare the two, to compare the two in the same model doesn't make sense to me. So although the findings are valid, and actually the study did seek to fill a gap in the research. There had not been any kind of data analysis of this type in a long time. A second study I looked at by Herensky and Wilbur, they looked at students who were actually in a BI program, meaning bilingual by educational, meaning the school focused on ASL and English in equal amounts and used ASL, American Sign Language, as the instructional language and used that as the foundation to learn English. And they compared highly proficient users of ASL, American Sign Language, versus less proficient users. Some of the children were identified early. They got to the school early. Other children maybe tried different options for education first. It didn't work out well, so they got to the school and they're already behind. So they examined family factors as well: language use in the home, did the mother sign, were the parents deaf or hearing, the age that the child was found to be deaf, diagnosis being deaf. So they found that proficiency in ASL was the single variable that explained significant variance in the outcome data. Now, the next slide. No. So the problem with, well, not the problem. What I see is something that I want to actually add to the research in this area is that this study was from one school for the deaf, and the bye-bye program or model is wonderful if you have enough students and you have the possibility and the professionals and whatnot. It's not, you don't find those programs across the country all over. Like I said earlier, a lot of deaf schools are closing. So there are some students, and this school is one of them, who become a magnet for higher achieving deaf students who don't want to go to a public school. There are deaf parents who have deaf children, and they'll send their kids out of state to these schools because they'll get a better education, they'll have a cultural background, understanding of who they are, and it leads to good outcomes for those students. Not for all students, though. So all the study says a lot, and it has you have an optimal situation. I think that to talk about recommendations, to talk about things to improve educational outcomes for all deaf and hard of hearing students, this doesn't answer that question. Now, the data set I'm working with, or will work with, has more than 150 deaf and hard of hearing students on the West Coast. There's a consortium of schools for the deaf, as well as programs for the deaf within schools. So you have deaf kids who are going to a public high school with an interpreter, with a tutor, with the support services, as well as students attending these schools for the deaf. So this is a unique situation. The schools agreed with one of our researchers where I work, and they're going to analyze the data for them, for the schools, and the schools are giving them data over so they can look at what things correlate to better outcomes for deaf and hard of hearing students. The data set is quite large. It has about 200 variables at the student and family levels. Things like how their pregnancy went, was there stress, did the mother drink? There was a whole bunch of things that I'm not going to use. But some of the important things are how old was the child when they were diagnosed with being deaf? What is their age of first exposure to ASL? Family factors. Did the parents sign? Did they try and learn sign? Are the parents deaf? How about the siblings? Any deaf siblings? All these things factor into the experience of a deaf and hard of hearing student, a deaf student. I'll just say for simplicity. And so they're important to know, right? So there's a whole host of data here that I can look at. And my challenge is to figure out which variables make sense in deafness, which has a unique set of variables that make sense to look at, as well as mathematics and how those variables are important for mathematics outcomes. And that's going to be modeling based on that. So the differences between the data sets. Like I said, the NLTS2 data, when you have only 500 deaf and hard of hearing subjects out of 11,000, I'm unsure how the data was collected with those deaf and hard of hearing subjects. When they're administering the Woodcock-Johnson, are they using an interpreter? They have a test administrator who understands testing deaf and hard of hearing students. It's different. So those are things that I wonder about the fidelity or the accuracy of that data. Now the other data, Horansky and Wilbur, their data was taken from one school. So it's one school. It's clean in the fact that you can see what things affect outcomes, what things are better for deaf and hard of hearing students in that situation. But did not include SES information or other family factors in the analysis. Like I said, the current data I have is quite as much richer. I don't think there's anything like it out there right now. These kids were, unfortunately, deaf and hard of hearing students are one of the most tested populations between the audiology test, the language test, the speech test, the intelligence testing. There's a whole host of measures that they get when they're in school. So this data set that I'm working with includes both the Woodcock-Johnson as well as the MAP data, which is it's a yearly, or actually several times a year, it's administered to see progress. So that's the data set I'm working with. My biggest challenge is figuring out how to approach the data in the state that it's in. So references here that are my PowerPoint slides. I have additional references in the paper that I'm posting. The paper is stressing the word working draft. The lit review is basically written. I have some bullet points in there I have to flesh out with the rest of it, and I got to get a better handle on the data set itself so I can talk about those things more intelligently in the paper. But thank you for listening, and that's my presentation, and that's it.